Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I'm your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. And now, with the History of the Papacy diptychs, we have, at the Alexandria level, Roberto, William B., Brian, Christina, Alex, Augustus, and Judy. At the Constantinople, we have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent. And reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great, Amma the Great, Geoffrey the Great, Frederick the Great, and Jim the Great. And with that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the History of the Popes of Rome and Christian Church. Welcome to a really fun episode of the History of the Papacy podcast. I am joined by Andy, host of the YouTube channel Engineer for God. Andy is walking through the Divine Comedy step by step. In this series of the History of the Papacy podcast, we are delving even more into the Bible. And although the Divine Comedy isn't the Bible, it is one of the most influential non-biblical texts in Western Christianity, not written by a church father or doctor. In this episode, Andy will give us an overview of the Divine Comedy, Dante, and why it is such an important text. Thank you so much for coming on today, Andy.
Yeah, you're welcome, Steve.
So I guess a good place to start is maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we can start getting into the details of the Divine Comedy. But really, what got you interested in Dante and maybe some of your background?
Yeah, so for starters, I'm a cradle Catholic. So I've always really been into my faith, pretty Orthodox. And I attend the traditional Latin Mass, the Tridentine liturgy, and I sing in the choir there. I stumbled into Dante, actually, kind of interesting. My favorite band is Tangerine Dream. They're a German electronic music band, and they've been around since the 70s, so they've really been around. And they made this one album, actually 3 albums, that is basically the Divine Comedy set to music. And it's some songs in English, some songs in Spanish, some songs in Italian, and some songs in French even. And it was, I was, wondering, well, what are all those lyrics, that are in the other languages? I kind of want to figure it out. So I ended up reading the comedy, and then I ended up going through a whole project where, because no one had translated the music lyrics, I actually went through the Divine Comedy, with in PDFs and doing Control F to find words that I was hearing. and then was able to find where it was and then make videos to have the lyrics on the screen. And it really was like quoted directly from the Divine Comedy, like all the lyrics of the songs. And so I read the Divine Comedy, over again because of that. And then I really got into it.
Going into the Divine Comedy and the approach that you did, how would you recommend somebody, before we even really start delving into the details, how would you recommend somebody who's completely fresh to the Divine Comedy? How do you dive into such a dense text?
Well, first of all, I would recommend reading a translation that's more accessible to modern English. There's like a lot of versions of it you can find very easily that are like Middle English, like the William Wordsworth Longfellow version. I first started reading that and I was like really confused. I mean, even if it's in modern English, it's still hard to understand. But this particular one, let's see, it was translated by some guy named Louis Biancoli, probably lesser known, but it's really cool because it has the English on one side and Italian on the other, so you can see the Italian. And it is important to be able to see the Italian because it rhymes, like the whole way through it rhymes. And it's just amazing how he was able to do that. And he even came up with his own rhythm and meter and everything.
Yeah, that's one of the amazing things, is that it's a poem, the Divine Comedy, and trying to translate poetry. That's something that we've talked about throughout this entire series on the history of the papacy, is that Dante's not exactly ancient, but when you are translating a text from a foreign language into English, you can oftentimes miss the meter and the rhyming scheme, which adds so much to the richness of the text.
Yeah. And I would recommend, I've never actually read it, but I've heard good things about it. The Dorothy Sayers version, I heard, because she's a poet. And so if you're a poet translating it, then you can still make it poetic. I mean, this that I read, it's just blank verse.
Now, let's start off with the very basics. What is the Divine Comedy?
So the Divine Comedy is a fictional allegory story written by Dante Alighieri, and it takes place in the year 1300. He kind of chose that year because it was like a nice round number, and it was like in the middle of his life, like age 35. It begins halfway along the journey of our life. So that's like in the middle of his life, like midlife crisis. He gets lost in a dark forest, and the forest represents his getting lost in sin. And he encounters these three beasts that represent different vices. And he especially can't get past the wolf, which is it's supposed to represent like avarice, I believe, and it's like attachment to the world and everything. And then he sees the ghost of Virgil, his favorite poet. And Virgil had been sent by Beatrice, who she actually was a crush that he had in his youth. And he kind of was inspired by her beauty. Like it was like a heavenly thing. Like it wasn't like oh, she's so hot, but rather it's more like he was looking into heaven when he saw her. And so he was inspired by her. And so in the story, she is the one that the Virgin Mary like hears, like someone's praying for Dante. He's like lost in life. And Beatrice is on the end of the prayer chain. Like the Virgin Mary tells St. Lucy, St. Lucy tells Beatrice, and Beatrice goes to Virgil to get him to help Dante. And so Dante is led by Virgil through all of hell first, and then after that, Purgatory. And when he gets to the end of Purgatory, Virgil has to leave because he belongs in hell. So Beatrice finishes the tour when he goes to heaven. And at the end, he sees God, and then he has to forget when he goes back to Earth.
It's a fascinating story of how what fascinates me is that how does somebody create such a metaphor? I think there's so few pieces of literature and in Western literature that creates such an entire metaphor. And I mean, in a lot of ways, he does universe building.
Yeah, and it feels very real because he includes real people in there and mixes it with Greek mythology as well. So it kind of is meant to make it feel like, in a sense, it almost feels like it's real, like it could have been a vision or something.
One thing I was wondering, and I don't know how much you can speak to this, but Dante was not a church man, and he wasn't a priest. He didn't have a bishop. He didn't have teaching authority as such. Where does maybe what he's written line up and maybe diverge with traditional standard Catholic teaching?
Well, he was definitely a solid Orthodox Catholic. So the ways that he would have deviated really would have been just things like putting people in hell, like Celestine V, you mentioned before, who was later declared a saint. Of course, at the time he wasn't declared a saint, so Dante would not have been like in sin or anything for claiming that necessarily. Just like, other people in the church, like even Thomas Aquinas got something that later was declared opposite of what he said. So it happens. And he did take artistic license in some things. Like, I don't think he meant everything to be like literally what the church teaches. Like the limbo, for instance, is an interesting one because he kind of uses it as a place to showcase all of his favorite righteous pagans that, he was like, okay, so they're not going to be in heaven because they were not baptized. And so he puts them in this state of limbo. Well, in reality, they wouldn't, adults that have the knowledge wouldn't end up in limbo. They would either reject Christianity or they would accept it. So in reality, if limbo does exist, it would only be where infants are, because because the church's teaching on limbo is that if it exists, because we're not sure it does, because God just could be merciful and all babies go to heaven. But if there's a baby that's not baptized, the idea is that limbo is where they would go, and it's not like a really bad. It's considered hell in quotes, but it's more like being on a paradise on earth where you're not in the presence of God, but you're still like in perfect natural happiness.
Are there some places where Dante contradicts himself, like the righteous pagans, but then he does put some pagans into higher realms he even puts some pagans into heaven as well, doesn't he?
Yeah, and the most famous one of those is he actually puts the Emperor Trajan in heaven, in the section, the Jupiter heaven, which is the heaven of the righteous rulers. And that one is very interesting. When Dante, the character, goes to there, he's like, Emperor Trajan, what the heck is he doing here? I mean, Christians were persecuted under him and everything. But there is like some myth, probably, I'm not sure if it's true or not, but like that Gregory the Great had a great love for Trajan, like having read about him. And he was like, it's like really sad that he wouldn't have made it to heaven. So he prayed for him. And then because prayer is not affected by time, Trajan gets like right before his death, like he has like a conversion, and then he's like able to go to heaven. And of course, like that's just, a story. We don't know if that's true or not, but it's really trying to show that, with God's mercy and God's justice, you can never really tell, like, because someone like Virgil, the character of Virgil, who's like very good, like in every way, and then he ends up in hell, versus someone like the Emperor Trajan, who it's like, I mean, he was good from a worldly standpoint, but you wouldn't have thought he would have made it to heaven. But God knows best, only God really knows the soul.
Maybe we'll start off with the Inferno. What's the layout of hell?
So you could say that there are 9 rings of hell. There is also an unofficial ring. So really, if you add up the rings, like official and unofficial combined, there's 10 circles of each in each. But for the proper ones, the hell has 9 sections, and then the mountain of purgatory has 7 terraces, and then the heaven has 10 celestial spheres. So in hell, the first stage, which is not really considered one of the proper hell, is the vestibule of hell, where all the cowards and indifferent are, because they're basically lukewarm. So like in the book of Revelation, it says God will spit you out of his mouth. Well, these people, like, hell doesn't even want them. It's like, so even hell rejects them. And then the first circle is limbo, which we discussed, which is the unbaptized. And then after that, you get into people who actually did bad things. And they're judged by Minos, who has like this serpent tail that wraps around them the number of times they have to descend. So the first one of those, the second circle, is for the lustful. And that's considered not as bad because sexual sin, sex is like a natural thing. So it's not considered like as bad as other sins. And then gluttony is another sin against your body. It's still not like one of the worst possible ones, but a little bit lower than lust, apparently. And then you get into greed, which greed is not just like hoarding riches, but also being a spendthrift. And that's the fourth. And then the fifth, you're now getting into wrath, which they're in the river Styx, just punching and beating each other up. And then you get to the heretics that are in graves and they're burning. And it's supposed to be ironic because the particular heresy was Epicureanism, which is basically atheism, pretty much, just the belief that there is no afterlife. And so it's just kind of, it's kind of a mockery of them. It's like they're in this grave, and like this political enemy of Dante is like looking around. He's like this doesn't exist. What the heck? And then you get into the seventh circle, which is the violent. So you're getting into really bad people now. And it's divided up into 3 sections. The first section is the violent against others. So that would be like your Adolf Hitlers of the world. And then you get to the suicides. And suicide really, it's for people that like, they were in their right mind. Because the Catholic Church doesn't condemn everyone who commits suicide. Like if you're not in your right mind, but if you like know what you're doing, then it's like, it's a sin. It's murder basically against yourself. So Dante has that. They turn into trees, which kind of alludes to like hanging from a tree.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors.
And then there's the violent against God, the blasphemous, the sodomites, and the usurers. So that there's 3 different zones of that subzone. And then you get to the part of hell that takes up 2/3 of the book because it's that nuanced, the circle of the fraudulent, and it's divided up into 10 parts. It's like the place is called Nalabulge. It's like a bunch of series of concentric rings that are like pits that the sinners are kept in each of the pits. And you have basically human traffickers and pimps, and then you have the flatterers, and then you have the simony, which has a lot of popes that abused the papacy, and then you have and there's so many, it's hard to remember off the top of my head like what they all are, but like the fraudulent is a really huge circle. And then the very center, there's a well that goes down to the worst kind of fraudulent person, which is a traitor, someone who has fraudulent relationships with people. And that is a lake, a frozen lake. And depending on how bad it is, closer to the center, you're more frozen down in the ice. The first section, the outer edge, is the traitors against family members, and then next is the traitors against political traitors, and then it's the traitors against friends and guests, and then in the very center, the worst possible, is traitors against their benefactors. So that there you have Judas Iscariot, and you have Brutus, who killed Julius Caesar, and then of course you have Satan himself, who betrayed God. So that is all of hell. And then purgatory is a little bit different. It's you have an area that's called anti-purgatory, which is sort of like the waiting room aspect of purgatory, where it's like they waited too long to repent, or they were excommunicated when they died, or they died violently and they didn't get a chance to have anointing of the sick before they died. That's one of the sacraments of the church. And so because of that, they have to wait for a period of time before they're even allowed to enter into the purgation process. And when they do enter it, they enter through this gate, and the angel is in charge of the keys. But there's a gold key and a silver key. The silver key represents justice, and the gold key represents mercy. And the angel is told by St. Peter to let people in by mercy if they are begging for mercy. So Dante gets through, and then the bottom terrace, it goes from worse to better in the mountain. So the very bottom is the prideful, and they have to carry these heavy burdens on their back because they didn't bear burden in their lives. They were like, oh, I'm everything, and now to make up for that, they have to carry this boulder, and they can't even see the beautiful paintings on the wall. And then the next up is the envious, and because they were looking at people and envious of them, they have to have their eyes sewn shut with iron wires. Ouch.
Yeah.
And then next up you have the wrathful, and they have to walk through a bunch of smoke. And the bottom three terraces are love perverted, Virgil explains. And then in the middle you have the slothful that are like a lack of love. So like sloth is like, okay, I don't feel like going to church. I don't feel like praying. It's kind of a lazy thing. It's like a lack of love. They have to run a marathon to make up for their lack of energy. And then the top of the mountain has the three. It's like where it's like love excessive. It's like love too much of a good thing. So you have greed, which again, it's both spendthrifts and hoarding. They have to lay on their bellies in penance and like look down at the dirt because they were looking at dirt throughout their lives. And then next you have the gluttonous, and they have to starve in front of beautiful fruit. And the fruit is the trees of the fruit is hanging from is like it's supposed to be like an offshoot of the original tree in the Garden of Eden that Adam and Eve ate from. But the fruit are too high, so they're not in any risk of sinning. So then the last stage is the lustful, and they have to walk through fire. And what's kind of interesting is his treatment of like both gay and straight sinners. They're kind of like encouraging each other, like one and the other. They're like they're giving each other encouragement from both sides, and I guess you could call it the sort of heavenly gay straight alliance in a way. And then you get to the very top of the mountain, and that is basically the Garden of Eden, and that's where he meets Beatrice, and Beatrice gives him a big scolding, like for crying for Virgil, even because it's like, well, he belongs in hell. Like, what were you thinking, Dante? I had to send someone from hell just so that you could be saved. Sheesh, Dante. That's basically what her attitude is. And then she takes him on a tour of heaven, and the lowest part of heaven is for those who were forced to break their religious vows. So like nuns that were forced to marry, and they, they're still in heaven. And the woman there, I forget what her name was, she says that she's perfectly content there, even though she is at the lowest part. And then next is Mercury, which is the circle of the worldly but good, basically. It's like people that served God using their riches and influence, but it's still one of the lower parts of heaven. And then you have the heaven of love. So it was kind of like worldly love in a sense, but still like they used it for good. And then you get above the bottom three, and you start to get into more distinguished figures. The sphere of the sun is all the enlightened ones. So your doctors of the church, like St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Francis of Assisi. So it's kind of like there's like a love going on where St. Thomas Aquinas, who's like of the Dominicans, of St. Dominic, he talks about St. Francis. And then St. Bonaventure, who's a Franciscan, talks about St. Dominic. So those two religious orders are kind of, loving each other. And then you get to the fifth heaven, which is Mars, appropriately named for your martyrs and crusaders. And Dante personally gets to meet his great great grandfather, Cacciaguida, who was a crusader. And then after that, it's the heaven of Jupiter, which is the righteous rulers like King David and Solomon, and that's where Emperor Trajan ends up. And they're like flying in the shape of an eagle, represents justice. And then you get to the circle of the contemplatives in Saturn, and over there it's like they're so holy by this point that Beatrice cannot smile, because if she smiles, it'll basically blow his face off, because it's that holy in that part of heaven. And then after that, he goes to the circle of the fixed stars, which is where you have your all the 12 apostles and Adam and Eve. It's like, the really famous people from the Bible. And then after that, you get to what's called the primum mobile, which is the heaven of the prime mover. It's the heaven where God created time and the angels. And like he talks about all the different ranks of the angels. And it's sort of arranged in like thinking that Earth is the center of the universe. So Earth is in the middle, and then you have all these planets are like circling around it. And it's like faster the farther out you get. And then the farthest out is the primum mobile. And then you get to the Empyrean heaven, which is the heaven where God himself dwells. And Dante explains that it's not like all those other circles are not like separated from the Empyrean. It's actually like the Empyrean is like the real heaven, and all those divisions are not really there. It's just kind of a way that heaven had to show itself to just a mere human like Dante. He kind of needed to understand it in forms of the division, so he could kind of see like how there's rewards, higher rewards and lesser rewards in heaven. And the very end, he sees the Virgin Mary, and then he sees the Holy Trinity itself, and then he has to forget what the Trinity looked like when he goes back to Earth.
It's such a fascinating division, and for Dante to have come up with all of that it's mind-blowing. One of the things that I find most fascinating is just the milieu it was created in. He's really writing in the high Middle Ages. The Black Death hasn't quite happened yet. It's about a half of a century in the future from there. But it's really Europe is at a peak point here where times are pretty good. It's nothing of the Dark Ages you would think of. What was the context Dante was writing in?
So, although like I guess you could say like it was peaceful as far as like there not being any Black Death or anything like that, but there was a lot of infighting in Florence is a city with a city-state, and it almost kind of had its own government. And there was all sorts of political drama, and Dante actually ended up fighting in one of the wars when he was younger. And there was different political parties that were fighting each other. Where the main one to start out with was just the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. And the Ghibellines supported the rule by the Holy Roman Emperor, and then the Guelphs supported the rule of the papacy. And then later on, the Guelphs fractured into two different camps, and it was really a reaction of the latest pope, who was Pope Boniface VIII, who you talked about a lot. And there was a lot of people that didn't like him, and there's the people that did like him. And so the black Guelphs were the ones that liked Boniface VIII, and the white Guelphs were the ones that didn't like him, but they both supported the papacy. So Dante was one of the white Guelphs, and the only reason they're called white or black is just because the two people that started it, one had black hair and the other had blonde hair. So the ones who supported the blonde-haired guy were the blacks, and then the blonde-haired one was the Guelphs, basically. And it had to do with some marriage. I forget exactly how it was, but like someone was going to be married, and then like he refused, and then it was like how with Italians it's all the different families and stuff, and it's like the warring clash of the different families, like the Capulets and the Montagues, for instance. So Dante was a white Guelph, and he came to power as a political leader. He was one of the priors, and I guess you could almost consider it like it's like an elected precinct delegate, like what we would have in America almost, but they might have a little bit more influence. And he was it's the details are kind of fuzzy for what exactly would happen, but it seems that, at least from Dante's perspective, he was sent to the Pope as sort of like an envoy, and then he was and then after that he was told that he could never return to Florence, or he would be burned at the stake. And it was all political, and Dante, of course, blamed Boniface for luring him away, and he thought that he was like responsible and everything. He never ended up returning, and he kind of wandered throughout the rest of Italy, and then he even kind of left he kind of left the Guelph party and just kind of was like, I'm my own party now, I guess. And he never saw his wife again, and his wife was not Beatrice, by the way. So I don't know how she would have felt about him writing the poem about Beatrice. But some of his kids ended up joining him eventually, and he actually died right after he finished writing the Paradiso. It was just wonderful that we happened to get the full comedy, and he didn't die before finishing it.
In your YouTube series, you're wrapping up the Inferno. And I find it fascinating the three people that Dante includes in the lowest level of hell. Maybe you can review that section a little bit, because I think there's a lot to dig into right there. And you get into that in your series, but maybe you can give us a summary of it.
Yeah. So of course, the easiest one to talk about is Judas Iscariot from the Bible, who betrayed not just a mere man, but the Son of God. And he was his benefactor. Jesus, all Jesus did was die on the cross to save Judas, and he decided to just betray him, and he didn't repent. He could have repented, but he didn't repent. He decided to hang himself instead. So he is in the mouth of Satan head first. There's Satan has three heads, and one of his heads, Judas is in Satan's mouth head first. And then you have Brutus and Cassius. And if you've ever read the play Julius Caesar by Shakespeare, which Shakespeare probably was influenced by Dante, because if you think about it, Dante came first. But in the play, Cassius is kind of the brains behind the operation of assassinating Caesar, and then Brutus is the one who actually stabs him, and so both are responsible in their own way. And in the play Julius Caesar, what Shakespeare is trying to do is through looking the mouthpiece of Mark Antony, he kind of sets up this juxtaposition, because Brutus is trying to make himself look good. He's oh, we did a noble thing. We needed to assassinate him because he was getting too powerful. And then Mark Antony just says oh, like there's this what Caesar has his will. Like what is he saying in his will? Oh, he actually meant to give all his money to the poor. Oh, but these men they're honorable, so we shouldn't do anything to them. And then the people are like, kill the traitors.
I think it's fascinating, and I never really thought about it this way, but you look at Judas, and he's a parallel or an inversion to Saint Peter, who Saint Peter denied Jesus 3 times, not just once, but 3 times.
Yeah.
But because he's penitent and seeks forgiveness, he's in an exalted position. Where how does Judas wind up in an inexalted position?
Yeah, well, again, it's like what Dante says about hell. It's like he really draws the picture that it's like they're in hell because they want to be there. They chose that. It's like God gives us free will, and he says, I love you too much to force you to go to heaven. So I'm leaving the choice up to you. And unfortunately for Judas, he chose not to be loved by God. He could have turned back, and after throwing the money into the temple, he could have gone to the foot of the cross and begged God for mercy, and he would have granted that. But instead, he just decided, like, I'm not worth saving, so he just hanged himself.
Yeah, it's a rebelliousness. I think that's what, from listening to your videos and the reading that I've done, Dante just encapsulates and understands medieval Catholic theology so well, even though he does play with it a little bit to create a narrative.
Yeah, and I should mention that he was pretty well read. I mean, he read Thomas Aquinas, for Pete's sake, which I haven't even read all of the Summa. I was listening to an audiobook of it, and I'm able to understand, like, bits and pieces of it maybe. And I mean, Dante was able to read that, and then it influenced his Divine Comedy as well, and also the Church Fathers. He read the Church Fathers too.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. I wonder what how he develops his world. Is he pulling it mostly from the Summa?
Well, I mean, the theology, like, I guess what he would probably do is, like, I think he was influenced, like, to say, like, the ranks of the angels, because there was different agreements about some of the intermediate orders of the angels, like what order they are in. But he pretty much bases his view off of Aquinas, and also ideas about which sin is worse, and like the ideas of the like in Inferno, a thief is considered worse than a murderer, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense today, because we wouldn't punish a thief for death, but with the death sentence, but we might possibly punish a murderer with the death sentence. So it seems like the opposite, but from the point of view of, like, theologically, God is sometimes violent, as we read in the Bible, and his violence is justified. So sometimes violence is justified, and it's like, and because of God, but fraud, all types of fraud, is uniquely a human thing. God is not a part of that at all. So it makes it more one worse than the other.
Yeah, I can see that, where with fraud, there's always a level of intentionality to it, where murder or killing someone, it could be in self-defense, it could be for war. There's a lot of gray area to that, where fraud is always an act of against someone.
Yeah. So yeah, there's that, and then there's the distinction between like lust, and then like the sodomites, and of course that's very controversial in today's world, but like you have to think of it from a medieval point of view. It's like there's like natural acts that you're doing with the wrong person, but then unnatural acts are like, it's against nature. That's because it's the seventh circle is like the violence against God is separated into three sections. The first is violence against others, and then there's violence against oneself, and then the violence against God, which is the first area, is the blasphemers, a direct violence against God, like cursing God directly. Then there's violence against nature, because nature is like a son of God, so to speak, because God created nature. And then the usurers are violence against art, and art, it doesn't mean like fine art, but it means like artisanry, like the act of being able to create like work and stuff. And so gouging people is sort of a violence, it's a violence against art, and it's almost like a grandson of God, because God created humans and then humans created work, the works of their hands.
Then we move on to Purgatory, and Purgatory is controversial because it's a Catholic doctrine that isn't completely bought into by other Christian denominations. Where did that exactly stand? Were there people in Dante's time who weren't down with Purgatory? Or was that just a generally accepted view at his point in the late 1200s?
Yeah, well, I mean, that always was. I mean, Purgatory was always like a doctrine going back even to the early church. It's just that you have the Orthodox Christians. They don't like the word purgatory, but they really do. They pretty much like agree about the concept of purgation before heaven. I mean, that's really all it is. It's really just the semantics of words. And of course, this was before Luther, so there hadn't been the Protestant Reformation, and that was like a big rejection of purgatory. And I think a lot of like the rejection really is just a misunderstanding of, it's like a lot of people look at the purgatory like it's a second chance, or it's a it like nullifies the blood of Christ, because like Jesus died for you, you don't need to go through purgatory. But really, the misunderstanding is that Jesus does die for our sins that are the everlasting punishment. He took the everlasting punishment on himself, but there still is the temporal punishment. And a good analogy would be like a kid throws a rock through someone's window and breaks it. So the dad, he pays for the damage. Okay, so now the kid doesn't have to be in, debt to the owner of that house. But the dad is like, okay, son, I paid for the damage, but I want you to be grounded for 3 weeks, because you need to feel, what you did, and it's sort of, it's a similar thing where it's mostly for our healing of our soul, if you didn't happen to get that healing on earth. And it's reserved only for people that are going to heaven. So it's not like it's a second chance at all. It's just like a stopping point on your way to heaven. And it's the application of the blood of Christ. It's not instead of the blood of Christ.
Yeah, I think that I agree that that's where people do have confusion with that doctrine, is that it's not somebody they're not hellbound in purgatory. They are going to get up to heaven at some point. It's that they're, I mean, in a crude way, they're getting cleaned up before they can go up to the big leagues.
Yeah. And like one day purgatory won't exist anymore because it'll be empty.
So then moving up, we'll wrap things up today just in the Paradiso. I tried to read it, and there's a lot of really heavy duty philosophy and theology in there. It's not for the faint of heart. Do you have a way that people it could become more accessible to somebody who isn't as grounded in the theology and the philosophy, the really heavy duty theology and philosophy that's encapsulated in that text?
I mean, really the only way I would be able to see it is what I've done is just research, listen to people talking about it and stuff. There's like a CD lecture series that talks about all of them. This professor from the seminary, let me see, I have it over there. I can grab it. It's by Henry Russell, and he really does a great job of explaining it. It's very brief though. He doesn't. I mean, he talks a lot more time about the other areas, but it's kind of enough to get you like a little bit of an understanding of some of the concepts. One of the most fascinating concepts to me that I was thinking that I was musing on a lot was the lunar heaven, where it's they didn't fulfill their vows, and it's like, so it almost feels like, well, it's unfair because it's not their fault that they were like wrenched. This woman was like wrenched away from her convent. The explanation is like, basically she could have tried harder to fight. She could have fight more, and she could have been like martyred or something. It's like it makes me think of the movie Silence. I'm not sure if you saw that movie.
No, I'm not. It was
sure. The Liam Neeson movie. It's about like there are missionaries that went to Japan.
Oh yeah, I haven't seen that yet, but it looks amazing.
Yeah, it's a very controversial movie because and I disagree with the message of it, but I think it's a very well made movie. It's like the priest is throughout the whole movie he's being tortured to like give in and apostatize, and in the end he ends up giving in because it's like he thinks he hears like the voice of Jesus saying, "It's okay, you can step on my image," and in the very end he like decides to still be a Christian but secretly, and it's kind of like he could have done it better. He could have become a martyr. Like there were actual martyrs that they show too. So it's like 3 cheers for the martyrs, but this one priest that gave in at the end, he kind of like he might still make it to heaven, like, but he's not going to get the greatest reward.
I think that is so fascinating because it ties into the early church and all of the conversations and debates that they had about salvation, and the conversation of, do people have to be perfect on earth, like the Donatists versus the mainstream, the lax position. And I think that it all comes to fruition, and you can see how the conversation developed over the course of a few hundred years into the high Middle Ages. As our last little bit here, what was maybe one of your favorite parts or parts of the whole Divine Comedy that just stuck out to you? And then maybe this could be a hook for listeners out there to dive in.
Oh man. And there's so many good things in there. But I would say that my favorite of the books is the Purgatory, because it's a very healing journey. It's like hell is very, dark and depressing. And then you get to the Purgatory and it's like beautiful colors and there's some comfort there as well in the suffering, because they're going to get to heaven eventually. And there's one scene where it's like in the anti-purgatory where they're waiting, it's the righteous rulers that didn't make enough time to pray, and they are just sitting down in this garden and they're singing Gregorian chants, and then there's a snake that slithers in the grass, and they're like, oh no, it's a snake, and then the angel chases it away, and it's like it's just to show them it's like God is comforting them, and they're in the Tangerine Dream. The song that has that part is just really beautiful. The music goes along with it, and the gate of Purgatory, like the symbolism of it, like that I learned from Henry Russell. It's just amazing. Like the steps that Dante takes up to the gate, it represents the process of penitent, like the sacrament of confession. Basically, it's like there's a cracked step that represents like sin, and then there's like a polished mirror step that represents like Dante looking at himself, and then a royal purple step that's like a representative of like Christ. And so then he does the mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa before the angel, and man, like it's just really beautiful seeing all the purgation that they go through. And I think a lot of people, they just read the Inferno and they stop there, but they really should, read the rest of it. And of course, the Paradiso definitely is worth it too, but it's probably, I would say probably my least favorite out of all of them, just because heaven is such an amazing place and it's impossible to even capture it. It's like there's no possible way to do it justice. And it is very hard to read because of the theological stuff, but if you want to finish the story, you read the whole thing.
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on to the show. If people want to find out about your work and learn more about you and your projects, where can they find it?
So I'm really just on YouTube. My channel is Engineer for God, and you got to search for Engineer for God's reflections on Dante's Inferno. And you can also find my music videos that I did of putting the lyrics on the screen of the Tangerine Dream albums. So you can see those too. I didn't get all the way through the Paradiso with that, but I got a lot of it. So if you wanted to watch those and kind of see, the Divine Comedy in like the form of music and images and make it beautiful, that's another thing you can check out on my channel.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much for coming on to the show, and people should definitely check out your work.